Welcome to Beautiful Thrift Homemaking. I'm Linda, and I'm reading through a vintage cookbook from 1917. I have a reprint here from Dover Publications. The cookbook has the fun title, A Thousand Ways to Please a Husband, and it is also an instructional novel. So we're following 1 year in the life of a newlywed named Bettina, and her husband is Bob. We learn a lot about menu planning. She shares her recipes with us, and she shares a lot of tips on hospitality. All right, so we're in the month of October, and we are wrapping that up with the last few chapters of October. We started in the month of June. Now we're in chapter 72, and where was the dinner? "Hello," called Bob at the door one evening. No answer. "Hello, Bettina," he called again. Again, the dark house gave forth no reply. Feeling, it must be admitted, a little out of harmony with the world that allowed weary and hungry husbands to come home to dark and empty houses when the clock said plainly that it was 6:15, Bob made his way to the kitchen. Perhaps Bettina had left his dinner there for him. Perhaps she had been called away. Or perhaps even she had rushed out on some errand after dinner preparations were begun. The kitchen, however, was so immaculate as to seem distinctly forbidding to a hungry man whose appetite was growing keener every minute. And he had been thinking all the way home that a hot dinner would taste so good. At that moment, a clamor of voices at the door aroused him. "You poor old Bob," cried Bettina, kissing him twice before Fred and Ruth without the least embarrassment. "Have you waited long?" "It seemed hours," admitted Bob. "Ruth and I have been to a tea for Alice. Fred came for her there, and I persuaded them to come home to dinner with me. I'll give you each something to do while I stir up a little cottage pudding. Then dinner will be ready in half an hour." "Half an hour!" cried Bob. "But Bettina, where is the dinner? I didn't see any." "In the fireless cooker, you crazy boy. Are you most starved?" "Well," said Bob, "that cooker was the neatest, stiffest looking thing in the kitchen. I didn't dream that it was busily cooking a dinner. Say, I'll be glad to see a hot meal again." The dinner consisted of round steak with vegetables, Dutch cheese, bread, plum butter, cottage pudding, and vanilla sauce. And in this chapter, we have Bettina's recipes for round steak with vegetables, cottage pudding, and the vanilla sauce to be served with the cottage pudding. All right, so we'll examine those recipes in detail after we read the next chapter. Chapter 73, Alice Tells Her Troubles. "And the minute I caught a glimpse of you, Bettina, at the tea this afternoon, I thought, oh, if Betty would only ask me to go home with her to a sensible, home-like dinner with no one there but herself and Bob." "Not even Harry, Alice?" "No, not even Harry. I'm so sick and tired of teas and dressmakers and wedding gowns and bridesmaids that I'm tired even of Harry too." "Almost." "But Alice, then why do it all? Why have all this fuss and feathers?" And Bettina's knife, with which she was cutting bread, came down with a click of vehemence. "It has always seemed silly to me, all the worry and bother." "But what can I do now, Bettina? I've started and I'll have to go through with it. Why, even now I ought to be home for dinner. Mother has several guests. But I phoned her that I had a headache and was coming here where I could be quiet. And I do have a headache and no appetite and—" "Just wait till you taste this nice brown meat that I have in the oven, Alice. The trouble with you is that you've been eating silly party food for such a long time. And tonight you are to have a sensible dinner with plain people." "Plain people? Who calls me plain?" interrupted Bob, coming in like a tornado. "Hello, Alice. How can you spare any time from all these festivities I hear about?" For dinner that night they had rolled flank of beef with bread dressing, browned potatoes, hot slaw, prune pudding with cream and coffee. And we have Bettina's recipes for the rolled flank of beef, bread dressing, and prune pudding. Yep. All right. Join me in a second and we will discuss these two chapters. You know, I just recorded these two chapters and the discussion of them, and I must not have pushed the button hard enough because they did not record. So here I am for round 2 on chapter 72 and 73's discussion. So chapter 72, Bob returns home from work. You know, he usually walks home from work. He got there at home about 6:15 and he did not find Bettina there, and he did not find dinner waiting, and he was perplexed. But within a few minutes, he had Bettina home, and she was accompanied by their friends, Ruth and Fred, who ate dinner with them that night. But Bob was concerned because he wondered how long would it take Bettina to make dinner, because when he went in the kitchen to look for her, the kitchen was immaculate and he saw no dinner preparations. But Bettina assured him it would only take her about a half an hour to make dinner. And as we found out by looking through the recipes, we realized that it's the dessert she needed the time to make, because the main dish was already done. It was in the fireless cooker, as she told Bob. And so he was surprised. I'm surprised he didn't smell it, but that was the round steak with vegetables that was cooking in there. So I went through what a fireless cooker is in chapter 7, and so I'll just read to you a little, or tell you a little bit about that. Fireless cooker was also called a hay box. It was an insulated box, and you had these discs that you would heat up and add to the box. You would also kind of pre-cook the food, partially. You made sure that the meat came to a good internal temperature, say 145 to 165 degrees, before putting it into the fireless cooker. And then you would leave it in there to cook for another hour or more, depending on the food and the recipe. And so that's kind of like our crock pot today, or our instant pot, because it was something you could leave and know that the remainder of the cooking would be done. And I like the way she made this round steak. She tenderized it and added the flour to the outside, so it was going, and browned it before putting it in the fireless. And she has those vegetables, so it's really not a nice, probably a nice gravy is made with that as it's cooking. And then, oh, I can tell you the recipe for that. The round steak with vegetables makes 6 portions, and there are 4 people eating dinner together. So she'll have some leftovers to serve for the next day's lunch, or for a dinner for the 2 of them. So that's wise, isn't it? 2 pounds of round steak, 6 potatoes, 6 carrots, and 6 onions, 2 tablespoons of flour, 2 tablespoons lard, 2 teaspoons salt, 1/4 a teaspoon of paprika, and 1/4 a cup of water. Pound the flour into the round steak with the edge of a small plate. This breaks the fibers of the meat, making it more tender. Wash and peel the potatoes, slicing in half lengthwise. Scrape the carrots and cut into 1/2 inch slices lengthwise. When she says scrape the carrots, I would say peel the carrots. Wash the onions and remove their outside skins. The onions must have had more dirt on them than they do in our stores today, as I've never had to wash an onion on the outside. Sprinkle the vegetables with 1½ level teaspoons of salt and the paprika. Remember, paprika is occurring time and again in the recipes during this era. Add the water and place in the bottom of the large fireless cooker utensil. Place the lard in a frying pan, and when hot, add the meat. Brown thoroughly on each side. Salt the meat with 1/2 level teaspoon of salt and place in the kettle on top of the vegetables. Place the heated discs of the fireless cooker over and under the utensil and cook at least 1 hour in the cooker. All right, and on to the dessert, which she's going to make, because you notice that it'll bake for 20 minutes. So she'll whip this together and put it in the oven, and then dinner will indeed be ready within a half an hour. So she's going to mix these dry ingredients: 1.5 cups of flour, 3 teaspoons of baking powder, which is the same as 1 tablespoon of baking powder, 1/4 a teaspoon of salt, and 1/2 cup of sugar. Then she's going to add 1 egg, 1/2 cup of milk, and 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla, and beat for 1 minute. Next, she's going to add in the melted butter, which was 3 tablespoons of melted butter, and pour it into a well-buttered tin pan, T-I-N, tin pan, a metal pan. She's going to bake it for 20 minutes in a moderate oven. Remember, a moderate oven is probably 325 to 350. And she's going to serve it warm with vanilla sauce. And I think the vanilla sauce sounds really good. It's 2/3 a cup of sugar, 3 tablespoons of flour, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 1/2 teaspoon of lemon extract, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 1.5 cups of water, and 1 teaspoon of butter. Here we have again the combination of vanilla and with lemon extract in a recipe, which we've seen her do before, and I just don't know about you, but I find that interesting combination. Mix the sugar, flour, and salt thoroughly. Add the water slowly. Boil for 2 minutes. Add the vanilla, lemon extract, and butter. Beat 1 minute and serve. If too thick, more water may be added. And so you're going to serve the vanilla sauce warm over the top of the cottage pudding. All right. So I don't know if you've had something like that before. One of these days, perhaps I will try that recipe. All right, chapter 73, Alice tells her troubles. She's whining a little bit here because she's had so many parties to go to. So many people are throwing parties for her because she's about to get married. She's had teas and luncheons, and she's just sort of sick to death of socializing, even though she is a socialite and was somewhat used to that life. But Bettina knows what's wrong. Bettina thinks, you've been eating silly party food for such a long time. And she says, you just need a good hearty meal with a sensible dinner with plain people. Okay, so she's going to make her this neat meat that's stuffed with a bread stuffing. The rolled flank of beef, 4 portions. 1 pound round steak, 1 inch thick. 2 tablespoons of flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, 2 1-inch cubes of suet. Now, suet is just lard, but it's a special lard that's a little bit more rich. It comes from around the kidneys of the animal. All right. Wipe the meat, trim the edges, pound on both sides with the edge of a plate to break the tendon. Place the dressing, given below, on the steak. Roll and tie with a cord. Roll in the flour and salt. Place in a small dripping pan. Put the suet on the top of the meat. Add enough water to cover the bottom of the pan and bake in a moderate oven for 50 minutes. 50. Baste frequently. All right, so bread dressing that's inside of that is made with 1 cup soft bread crumbs, 2 tablespoons melted butter, 1 teaspoon of chopped parsley, 1/2 teaspoon of chopped onion, 1/8 teaspoon celery salt, 1/2 teaspoon salt, 1/8 teaspoon pepper, 2 tablespoons of water. Mix all the ingredients in the order named, stirring lightly with a fork. Place in shape on the meat. Care should be taken not to have the dressing soggy or heavy. So when you place the dressing on the steak, before you roll it up, make sure that it is placed on there lightly, that you don't pack it down. You don't want to pack it down. Okay, and then you're going to roll the meat over it and tie that up. So that makes me think of our Thanksgiving time and the word dressing and the word stuffing and how there's somewhat of a regional variation, I believe. It could also be that technically stuffing is anything you put inside of the meat or inside of the turkey cavity, and dressing would be served as a side dish. could be the same exact combination of ingredients, but called stuffing when it's inside the bird and called dressing when it's served separately. However, I think it's also regionally different. So we always called ours cornbread stuffing. No, we called it cornbread dressing. Gosh, now I can't even think which one we did call it because I've said so many times of it. Okay, in any case, my mother was Southern and she made cornbread stuffing. Okay, and it had celery in it along with the onions and some poultry seasoning, and I love it. I wonder in your family if you guys use the bread stuffing or the cornbread stuffing. There's quite the debate on that of which is better, but it just depends on what you were raised with, doesn't it? And then she made a prune pudding to go with that. And we've had other prune dishes, and in fact, when I look ahead to the next chapter, we're going to have another prune dish. So recently I posted some pictures that I had taken because we have a prune grove growing behind our property, and it was harvested in, they usually harvest in early September. And I had picked some of the prunes off that tree. Those are called I had picked some of those plums. They're called French plums. And I had cut them open so you could see the inside. And I removed the pit. And then I showed you what they look like, what prunes look like out of a bag. And yes, they go from one very fresh fruit to this dried wrinkle thing that looks like a very large raisin, right? So if you want to see that, it's at the end of one of my recent videos. So we're in Northern California, and there are prunes grown here. Or they always call them that. In the farmers call them prunes. They say a prune grove, and yet a lot of people would say plum because, that's what the fruit is. But they're not prunes until they're dried. So, all right. Same thing, though. Now, I have no idea if they took a Santa Rosa plum or some kind of fresh-eating plum, a different variety. If they took those and put them through the same process, I wonder what those prunes would taste like. Probably a lot more tart and be very, very different. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going on about that. I'll see you soon for our next 2 chapters, as we're still in the month of October. Thank you for joining me, and God bless your homemaking.